Breaking tonight from here in Washington, a desperate search for answers, a grim search for bodies after that devastating mid-air crash. 67 lives lost in a moment, a crash between a military helicopter and a passenger jet.
We have been told that there are no survivors.
Among the passengers, young figure skaters, their parents and coaches.
I've never seen anyone love skating as much as these two, and that's why I think it hurts so much.
Heartache stretching across the United States, around the world, and at home in Canada.
I'm devastated on every level.
What we're learning about the final moments in the air, the U.S. president already laying blame.
We do not know what led to this crash, but we have some very strong opinions.
Extensive coverage of the worst U.S. aviation disaster in decades. Also breaking here in Washington tonight, the president says the tariffs are coming.
We'll be announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico.
Is Canada ready? At issue, standing by.
From CBC News, this is The National with Chief Correspondent Adrian Arsenault in Washington.
Thanks for joining us tonight. We are just outside the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, where the search for answers and for victims is still underway after that devastating mid-air crash. All 67 people on board the plane and helicopter involved are dead. Many of them were part of the figure skating community, the immense loss leaving people around the world grappling with a profound grief. As the National Transportation Safety Board tries to piece together exactly what happened, the U.S. president is already laying blame, saying diversity initiatives lowered standards for FAA employees. As we begin tonight, a sense of where all this is unfolding. That crash happened midair right beside the airport. The wreckage and the search for victims happening in the Potomac River. All of this bordering Washington, D.C., just a few kilometers from the White House. Now, the airport here is back open. You'll be hearing flights taking off and landing. There are commuter trains coming and going, but the work to unravel how a plane and helicopter crashed here last night is far from done. And on that front, late tonight, there's word that investigators have now recovered 2 flight recorders from the passenger jet. Paul Hunter starts our coverage tonight with what we know so far.
When morning came to the ice-cold waters of the Potomac River after a night of desperately searching for survivors, divers off the shore of the U.S. Capitol turned to the grisly task of looking only for answers and bodies.
Despite all those efforts, we are now at a point where we are switching from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. At this point, we don't believe there are any survivors from this accident.
The bright light in this video is American Airlines Flight 5342 with 60 passengers on final approach to Washington National Airport. The speck of light to the left, an approaching military helicopter on a training flight headed straight for the jet. Then this. Both plummeted into the river.
Medic 101, Medic 102, Medic 207, Ambulance 411.
It set off an intense rescue effort with remnants of the jet and helicopter in waist-deep water. The plane upside down, broken into 3 large pieces. First responders trying but failing to find anyone alive.
Extrication equipment will not be needed until daybreak at this location. It's too dangerous.
This video shows how the airport typically presents in darkness. Early indicators suggest the 2 aircraft were in standard flight patterns. Air traffic controllers were aware of both. The helicopter was told of the passenger jet. Say some, even if there was an alarm in the cockpit.
We had 2 aircraft approaching each other probably at a very high rate of speed in the last few seconds of flight. And you know, you've got a lot going on in the cockpit. And thing is if an alarm goes off, they might have had mere seconds to adjust, and they might not have known what they were adjusting to.
Authorities stress they are in absolute early stages of their investigation.
Our mission is to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and to recommend changes to prevent it from happening again.
I'd like to request a moment of silence for the victims and their families, please.
At the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump said the country is in mourning, but then quickly turned to politics,
Thank you very
seeming to pin early blame for the crash on the Biden and Obama administrations, and the suggestion they put diversity ahead of merit at the U.S. Federal Aviation Authority.
I do want to point out that various articles that appeared prior to my entering office, and here's one. The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing. This was in January 14th, so that was a week before I entered office. They put a big push to put diversity into the FAA's program.
Pushback on that, Adrian, was swift. Senior Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer said it made his stomach turn. The group representing lawmakers on Capitol Hill from the Asia-Pacific region called Trump's comments despicable, racist lies.
And yet, Paul, Donald Trump, as I understand it, then seemed to just double down.
He did. Not long after those comments in the briefing room, he signed a presidential memorandum on aviation safety, in which it's underlined future hires at the FAA will be based on merit, not diversity, and again suggesting Barack Obama and Joe Biden did the opposite. This is a key aspect of Trump's framing of his agenda, and clearly choosing this moment immediately after the crash to emphasize it. But Trump did not provide any evidence diversity at the FAA played any role in the crash. One other note, Adrian, as you mentioned off the top, word indeed tonight, the two so-called black boxes, the voice and flight data recorders have been recovered from the airplane. That should bring some answers on the collision soon.
Indeed. All right. Paul Hunter in our bureau in Washington. Thank you, Paul. So it will take time, obviously, to get the answers everyone so desperately needs. But for those who knew the victims, the shock wave of grief hits fast and it is brutal. As Katie Simpson shows us, that includes many in the figure skating community.
Spencer Lane loved skating, and like so many 16-year-olds, social media. He built a following on TikTok his dad says he was so proud of.
He really loved that community, and it was at a point where we would go. We were in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We went to a skating rink, and everyone was like, Spencer Lane's here. Oh my God, Spencer Lane's here.
Spencer was flying with his mom, heading home from a training camp, among the 14 people connected to the elite skating world on that American Airlines flight.
These kids and their parents, they're here at our facility in Norwood 6, sometimes 7 days a week. It's a close, tight bond, and I think for all of us, we have lost family.
13-year-old Gina Ha and her mom were on board too, alongside well-respected coaches, married pair skaters Vadim Nomov and Zhenya Shishkova, who won gold at the 1994 Worlds. 6 of the dead connected to the Boston Skating Club, where Olympian Nancy Kerrigan also trained.
Not sure how to process it. Oh, shoot, I'm sorry.
No, you're okay.
Which is why I'm here.
Ina Volyanska dedicated her life to coaching. And it's the impact on kids her ex-husband worries about most.
It's tough, you know, like, they're gone. That's what kills me, it's these kids. Because I work with kids all day. It's just one of those things where you don't want to see anyone go through this.
Flight attendant Ian Epstein was a 53-year-old father of 4. First Officer Sam Lilly had recently gotten engaged.
You know, just very motivating as a person and as a teammate. No matter the conversation, no matter the topic, he was just a very kind soul.
Wichita, Kansas, where the flight originated, is believed to be home to many of the victims yet to be named.
All of us are going to know people who know people. So it's a great time to double down on caring for each other.
And in this moment of grief, everyone seems to just be trying to hold it together.
This is a terrible tragedy that will unite those in Washington, D.C. and Wichita, Kansas forever.
Adrian, some families are making their way here to Washington, D.C. They have to go through the identification process, and investigators are going to brief them in private so they can learn about their loved ones' final moments privately.
You know, Katie, as we stand here, I'm well aware that part of the Black Hawk helicopter's in the water over there. The plane is a little further up the river, and yet nothing landed on the airport, on the highway, on the commuter train there. And as horrific as it was, you're constantly aware here of how much worse it could have been. You've been here all day. What's been lingering for you?
The airport is getting back to business, but what really stands out to me is how eerie it feels to know that just a day ago, people came here, were ready to pick up their loved ones. They were so close, but never made it home. As far as anything I've seen from people or heard from people, there are no signs that they're concerned about air travel safety, and they're going about their day.
Okay, Katie Simpson, thank you.
Thanks.
The impact of this tragedy is being felt deeply, of course, in Wichita. It is home to about 400,000 people. So the mayor of Wichita, Lily Wu, is with us now. So Mayor Wu, thank you for joining us, making time for us. I'm so sorry we have to have this conversation. You know, I think about Wichita. You just had these phenomenal skating championships. Your city was on a high. And I'm wondering, what is the measure of this loss for your city?
Well, the city of Wichita, the air capital of the world, was honored to host the U.S. Figure Skating Championships just last week. Our community was grateful to host these fantastic athletes, their families, fans, and our community took them in as family too. So I know that many in the skating community are truly at a loss for words. And what I ask of everyone right now is to please send out those prayers to the families of those affected, to the families who are part of the first responding team right now in Washington, D.C., and send those prayers to our entire Wichita and Kansas community. We need to come together for those family members as they need that comfort, and they need those community members to come together.
Is there something, Mayor, that you've learned today about the people on that plane that you just cannot shake?
I personally know one of the individuals, and so it is weighing on me heavily, along with several of the council members who also know this individual. They are someone's daughter, son, sibling, family member, community member, and so the impact of these individuals will be felt not just in Wichita and Kansas, but America and throughout the world. And so I really ask all of us to think about those families and think about our own families, because I think what it reminded me today is how fragile life is. And if we can put that into perspective.
What happens for you next in Wichita, Mayor?
Well, first and foremost, I'm so grateful that our community came together this afternoon for a community-wide prayer. I know that there are several others that will be happening throughout this entire week. I ask that our community really unite around the message of using our words for comfort, using our actions for helping and uplifting others, and really caring about the individuals together. I do believe that that is the sentiment of every Wichitan here that has been impacted, and all those throughout the nation who also have been impacted by this tragedy.
Mayor Wu, thank you for this. Be well. Well, many questions about this crash remain. Details about the complexities of landing in Washington, D.C. are being brought to light. Thomas Digg digs into those existing concerns and the added factors that were at play just before this tragedy took place.
From far away, the jet and the helicopter appear locked in a slow-motion disaster. But how could this have happened?
Oh, what happened?
Oh my God!
Consider Washington's crowded airspace, where military choppers and commercial airliners can also cross paths.
Yeah, it's very unique. Not only is it congested, the runways are quite short as well, but you have the airspace is restricted.
D.C. is served by 3 major airports, each seeing hundreds of flights a day, with pilots having to avoid 2 no-fly zones covering key buildings like the White House and the Vice President's home. Complicating the descent on Wednesday night, a late request for the jet to land on Reagan's runway 33. An arrival that can look harrowing to passengers even in daylight, as the tarmac suddenly appears just meters from the river.
If there was something out on the river or traffic, you're not going to be able to see it, especially if it's below you.
Airliners are designed to alert pilots to mid-air danger.
Increase climb. Increase climb.
But not while on descent. What's more, the helicopter crew assured air traffic control they could see a jet ahead.
This club has an aircraft inside precision separation.
At night, you may be able to make out some lights, but it takes a few seconds to really figure out exactly how those lights are traveling.
The rush to recover the victims' bodies comes first, then efforts to learn what happened on each aircraft.
We do not know enough facts to be able to rule in or out human factor, mechanical factors.
From the wreckage in that frigid water, there will be clues, but the search for answers is expected to take months. Thomas Daigle, CBC News, Toronto.
We will continue to follow the story here from the scene where recovery efforts went on all night, all day, and into the night again. We will hear more, too, from the figure skating community back in Canada, grappling with this astonishing loss. But first, we have to turn to another breaking story here in Washington. As Donald Trump signed that presidential memorandum in the Oval Office, his attention swung back to Canada with a promise those tariffs are coming on Saturday. Ashley Burke now with Trump's renewed threat.
Donald Trump at it again, using his executive powers and repeating his threats.
We'll be announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico.
The U.S. president still warning 25% tariffs are coming starting this Saturday.
We will really have to do that because we have very big deficits with those countries. Those tariffs may or may not rise with time.
Those tariffs also may or may not target Canadian oil.
We're going to make that determination probably tonight on oil. Yeah, because they send us oil, we'll see.
Ministers are in Washington still trying to stop those tariffs, with contingency plans underway back home if their efforts fail.
One thing that you can be very sure about is the government of Canada is prepared. The government of Canada will retaliate. The government of Canada will protect workers.
Canada's focusing on trying to show Trump he got what he said he wanted, more security at the border, including 2 newly leased helicopters now on patrol.
Affords us more flexibility, really, in terms of rapid intervention, capabilities that we weren't able to do before.
The federal government says it's spending more than $1 billion on new border security measures. The industry minister adding Canada listened to Trump and acted, but facts matter too.
Let's be clear as well that less than 1% of the fentanyl that enters the United States come from the northern border, and less than 1% of the illegal immigrants come from the northern border.
The Prime Minister is expected to meet on Friday with his Canada-U.S. Council, a panel of experts helping navigate this crisis. Ministers will also continue meeting with U.S. officials, all while the clock keeps ticking on Trump's tariffs. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now, Rosie and the At Issue crew are joining us in about 15 minutes to dig deeper into the approaching tariff deadline and why Canadian oil is becoming such a hot topic. Well, chaos erupts in Gaza as more hostages are released. The prisoner and hostage exchange that puts a fragile ceasefire to the test. And many questions remain about how a helicopter collided with a passenger jet. A former Black Hawk pilot tells us, with all the safeguards, it's a shocking outcome.
It's a horrible feeling to realize that even with all of that in place, these types of things still happen.
We're back in 2. These satellite images show crews on the Potomac River between Washington and Virginia searching through the debris field for bodies and for answers as to why a helicopter collided with a passenger jet, killing 67 people. There were no survivors. The difficult recovery effort, of course, continues. So we will have much more coverage on the disaster in just a few minutes. But first, in the Middle East, 8 more hostages are free tonight after being held captive by Hamas for nearly 500 days. They were released in exchange for more than 100 Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. Senior international correspondent Margaret Evans now with the tense and chaotic scenes.
This was the stage for the first hostage release on Thursday, the apocalyptic-like ruins of Jabalia in what's left of northern Gaza. On the ground, a Hamas video team in full swing, instructing kidnapped Israeli soldier Agam Berger to wave before handing her over to the Red Cross and a journey home to waiting loved ones. The release of 2 of her compatriots and 5 Thai farm workers further south in Khan Yunis was just as choreographed, but far more chaotic, including Islamic Jihad militants. The clearly rattled Arbelia Hood and 80-year-old Gadi Moses led through a crushing crowd by their captors. The world thinks we're broken, but we're victorious, says Mahmoud Shakura. Buses in the occupied West Bank carrying Palestinian prisoners due to be released from Israeli jails were ordered to turn back at one point. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemning what he called shocking scenes. We will not accept any violations, he's saying. In the end, 110 Palestinians, boys and men between the ages of 15 and 69, were released. The terms of the ceasefire are that 33 hostages will be exchanged for nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners over a 6-week period. The one so far a reminder of how fragile the deal is and how difficult for families waiting for loved ones to come home. Margaret Evans, CBC News, London.
We want to return to our top story, the mid-air disaster and one community that has lost so many.
I'm devastated on every level.
The grief being felt in the sport of figure skating across the U.S., Canada, and the world. And Rosie's here with more on the looming tariff threat.
Hey, Adrienne, yeah, as we saw in Ashley's story, Trump is not backing down. He repeated those threats again today.
And I'll be putting the tariff of 25% on Canada.
So is Canada ready? What can we do? Chantal, Althea, and Andrew join me to talk about that and a whole lot more.
The long road to recovery here in Washington has taken one small step forward tonight, with officials confirming they've now recovered 2 flight recorders from the American Airlines jet, all in the hopes of better understanding exactly what happened in the final moments before the crash. As we told you earlier, this tragedy has rocked competitive figure skating. As Julia Wong shows us, among the victims are talented young skaters, their coaches and family members. A big loss being felt in Canada, too.
Ekaterina Gordeva's life revolves around figure skating. It's how she met Vadim Naumov and Evgenia Shishkova back in the 1990s.
We're a great, beautiful pair team. Very nice and kind people.
Watch this triple twist, the landing. The 94 world champions in pairs figure skating were on the American Airlines plane with young skaters coming back from a development camp in Wichita. In the early 2000s, they and Gordeva had moved from Russia to the United States to coach.
They always would do a real connection with the student, like a human connection, not just as a coach.
Around the world, the grief in the skating community is profound. A moment of silence was held Thursday before the European Figure Skating Championships.
The first thing that I thought about was the 1961 crash.
For one skating commentator, the crash has similarities to another disaster that killed the entire U.S. figure skating team on its way to a world championship. Flying is a routine part of the sport.
What I really am thinking about tonight is the parents. So you've got, a 13, 14-year-old who might be going to a skating competition with their coach. Perhaps you can't go with them. how comfortable do you feel putting them on a plane?
Canadian-American Olympian Caitlin Weaver worked with several of the young skaters who died.
These are faces that I've seen before. These are faces that I watch grow up year by year. And my students know them so well as well. And, these are their friends. These are their people. I'm devastated on every level.
Weaver says the future of skating was lost in the crash.
These are the best youth skaters in the country. We've lost a lot.
A tight-knit community now reeling with that loss. Julia Wong, CBC News, Edmonton.
Now it's time to go deeper into the stories shaping our world. Bracing for a looming trade war at issue adds up the huge potential costs for Canada. But first, a mid-air collision claimed 67 lives right next door to the U.S. Capitol. How does that even happen?
Everything was standard in the lead up to the crash.
It's the deadliest night for U.S. aviation in decades. In a moment, we'll ask a seasoned pilot what it's like to fly these crowded skies. Now, before we get his perspective, let's go over what happened minute by minute. We've heard more than once how normal everything seemed right up until the very last moments. American Airlines Flight 5342 took off from Wichita, Kansas at 6:22 p.m. Eastern with 64 people on board. Destination, Washington. In Virginia, an Army Black Hawk helicopter like this one left Fort Belvoir Army Base. The 3 soldiers on board engaged in routine retraining that's required every year. The Black Hawk was headed south. Headed north, approaching the airport to land, was Flight 5342. At 8:43 p.m., air traffic controllers cleared the flight crew to land at Reagan National Airport.
Pushing 5342, check runway 33.
Yeah, we can do 33.
At 8:47 p.m., the control tower warned the Black Hawk about Flight 5342.
Pass 25, get the CRJ in flight. Pass 25, pass behind this CRJ.
Seconds later, a webcam captured the deadly crash. The sound, you can only imagine.
Crash, crash, crash. This is Alert 3. Crash, crash, crash.
8:48 p.m., the control tower sounded the alarm. 8:58 p.m., first responders descended on the scene and leapt into action in a frantic rescue effort.
This is an active operation that's going to last many hours as we continue to work through recovery efforts and rescue operations.
About 300 responders answered the call in patrol boats, helicopters, and ambulances. But by morning, it would be deemed a recovery mission, not a rescue.
I think this was preventable, absolutely.
So let's bring in someone with a particular expertise here. Mike Sagely has flown a Black Hawk military helicopter more than a dozen times along the Potomac here in Washington, and he's with us now from Palmdale, California. So Mike, can you put us inside, if you will, the cockpit of a Black Hawk at night flying near this airport? I mean, what would they have been seeing? What are they doing? Who's looking out for other aircraft? What's it like in there?
Well, that is a dedicated helicopter route. It's used quite frequently for helicopters to transit past Reagan Airport there. And it's designed to try and do that with simultaneous operations of commercial aircraft, obviously. And the routing structure there runs along the far side of the river from the airport, and it has altitude restrictions on it as well. And then, of course, you're under ATC control. And anytime you throw the night in there, the level of risk, of course, increases for all aircraft for that matter. And in this instance, there's probably several things that allowed this to sort of develop into what it was. Like, I'll give you a small example. At night, apparently they were flying with NVGs, and then in here in California on the firefighting side, we wear them as well. And of course, they have certain limitations to them. They're a great tool, and we have the ability to flip them up and down on our helmet. And when I'm in an urban environment, for example, where there's a lot of backlighting and there's a lot of cultural lighting, I tend to flip them up and just use the naked eye. In this particular instance, it appears that they were wearing them, and as they probably should, I'm sure they were doing training. And there are certain situations where you have the ability to lose visual sight of an aircraft when it's sort of backdrop with cultural lighting. In other words, there's clutter. There's so much light and clutter that the aircraft that you're looking at blends in. And I'm not saying that that happened in this particular instance, but it certainly is a possibility.
Can I just clarify something that you're talking about with the night vision goggles? Because the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, had said today that in the Black Hawk they were wearing their night vision goggles. But it sounds like you're saying that you can flip them up because sometimes there's so much light pollution down there, if you will. Is it just easier to just flip them up and just look with the naked eye?
Well, that depends. It depends on the conditions, and that's up to the pilots, obviously, to determine when they want to utilize that system to their benefit. It's a great enhancement at night, and there are certain limitations to it. I can only speak for how I utilize them now and versus how I utilize them in the military. Most of the time when you're doing military training, specifically night vision goggle training, you're going to wear those systems and, for the purposes of training and proficiency. And in this particular instance, it sounds as though they were.
Okay. Mike Sagely, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Fly well.
Thank you.
So a narrow corridor, busy with aircraft and lights. Let's bring in pilot Josh Sherrard to talk about what it is like landing in a situation like this at an airport like this one. So Josh, thank you for joining us. Reagan National is busy again, and it makes me wonder, what can you tell us about landing in an area that is this busy?
The D.C. area is one of the most congested areas for aviation in the country. I mean, you have Reagan right there, you have Dulles just to the west, Andrews Air Force Base to the east, and BWI to the north. Not to mention, it's one of the most restricted flight areas in the U.S. So landing there is always a task. It takes 100% focus from both of those pilots to make sure they're doing everything right so that we can deconflict that airspace and keep separation and to keep things like what we saw last night from happening.
Everyone is looking for answers, whether they're in aviation or they're passengers. I mean, there are so many questions about the resourcing or even the abilities of air traffic control, and questions including from the president. And when you hear those questions, what do you think?
I look at this with a very critical eye. I'm a commercial pilot. I have a flight tomorrow. I have to put people on an airplane, and they have to trust that I am going to be getting them to their destination safely. They're not trusting anyone else to do it. It's me. So I look at this with, what do we know now, and what do I need to do different, if anything, before I put people on my plane? And really the question comes down to what those pilots knew at the time of the collision in the seconds leading up. In all honesty, I think air traffic control did exactly what they were supposed to. They saw the planes were getting close. They asked if they could see each other. The Black Hawk helicopter said, yes, I can see the other aircraft. And at that point, air traffic controllers assumed that they would be able to maintain visual separation, which is why they didn't give any direction. Unfortunately, that just wasn't the case here.
What a nightmare. Josh Sherrard, thank you very much for making time for us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Investigators have so much work ahead of them, so many answers being rightly demanded by so many. We'll be following the investigation and reactions to this tragedy. Stay with us.
At issue tonight, preparing for tariffs. Donald Trump says he still plans to bring in a 25% tariff on Canada.
For Canada and Mexico, 25%. That's coming on Saturday. That's coming on the 1st, Saturday.
While Ottawa says it is ready to retaliate.
I also made clear that should tariffs be imposed, we would retaliate, and everything was on the table.
So is Canada ready for Donald Trump's tariffs, and has Ottawa's message gotten through to anyone in the United States? I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it down on At Issue Tonight. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Good to see everyone. Chantal Hébert, let's start with you. Where do you think we are at with this? Because it is very hard to get a read on whether this is going to happen on Saturday, whether it's going to be as big as the president says, and sort of how this is going to unfold.
and it's hard to get a read because there you have the President of the United States being asked, will this apply to oil? And he says, I think we're going to discuss that tonight. Does that sound like a coherent, cohesive structural plan, or does it sound like whatever my mood is at 9 o'clock at night is what's going to happen? So is Canada ready for that? I think that the Canadian government believes that it has made inroads, not with Donald Trump, but with people who are around Donald Trump. And I get the impression from the people I talk to that there is disagreement within the president's inner circle as to where to go with what. But will things happen on Saturday? Possibly, probably. Are we ready? Well, it depends. It's really hard. It's like pinning the donkey. You're blindfolded. You try to pin that tail on the donkey. Sometimes you end up pinning it on its ear.
Yeah, I mean, even like just discussing our coverage plans of Saturday, we have 25 different scenarios, Andrew, so I can't imagine being the government having to come up with the various scenarios to respond to whatever he does or doesn't do.
Yeah, so on top of everything else, it's important to understand about Trump and the people around him is they don't know what they're doing. They're making it up as they go along. They're not particularly smart people. They don't particularly understand the world very well. That's why they're part of Trump's universe. You can actually tell pretty much from the public record that there's a lot of disagreement. You know, the words coming out of Howard Lutnick's mouth about, oh, this is all just about fentanyl and immigration are very different from what might come out from Peter Navarro's mouth, who's the trade advisor and you know, sort of a dyed-in-the-wool true believer in tariffs. And Trump is, whoever talked to him last, he certainly seems to be a believer in tariffs in principle, the way he keeps rabbiting on about McKinley and the golden age of the 1890s, which was in fact a terrible time for American economy. So yes, among other things, that adds to the difficulty for anybody trying to plan for it. I still think the best guess is that there will be a tariff put on. It will be painful. It will not be the end of the universe. The thing about a tariff is it will have short-term impact in terms of probably, you know, you go through a short-term recessionary period, and it will have a long-term impact in terms of you get a less efficient allocation of resources that comes out of it. What you don't get is catastrophe. A lot of things change as a result, one of which is you get a lower dollar. And it's one of the reasons why Trump can't solve his trade deficit problems because of this. So I would say the best plan is he's probably going to put on a tariff. It's going to be interesting to see whether he carves out something for the oil sector or not, in which case we'll have some very interesting politics here because if Alberta's been quite right in saying we don't want to be singled out for punishment. We don't want to be singled out as the only sector or the only province that has to deal with whatever retaliatory actions we put on. But neither, it seems to me, should Alberta and the oil patch be the only sector that escapes having to deal with the economic pain that this comes in. So we're going to have some interesting discussions as a country.
Yeah, Althea?
Well, I mean, I think it's funny that you're asking us for our crystal ball into Donald Trump's mind because we obviously have no clue what's going to happen on Monday. But we can tell you about how prepared the government is. I mean, it has been working on this plan. Well, I would say the plan has been solid for weeks. They've been working on it for more than several months. Some people might say even a year. They have an escalatory plan, as in like wave 1, wave 2, wave 3 in terms of retaliatory action. It is not clear when even the president says, like he did today, that, well, maybe we will do oil, it depends tonight, it depends what the price is. Like I took that to mean, and this has been communicated to the Americans, that if you do slap tariffs on Canadian oil, the price will increase per gallon for you. Somebody a government official told me, well, they thought that that meant that we needed to convince Donald Trump that we're not dumping Canadian oil in the U.S. Like, no one seems to have a real clue what his problem is. And in fact, probably because he doesn't seem to know what his goal is either. Is he using the tariffs as a negotiating tactic? Is he using the tariffs because he actually wants to impose them in order to raise money? Not clear. I will say that part of the government's plan and the thinking that's happening at the moment is how to help Canadians and industries who are affected. They're going through all the departmental spending plans to see what amount of money has been lapsed, so what funding the government departments have not used to see if they can reallocate it so they don't need to recall Parliament, for example. I'm told there is a $1 billion fund, a reserve fund, that they can also access. So there could be financial measures, including things that don't need legislation, like beefing up EI, for example, or business supports, where we don't actually need to recall the House.
Okay, but so this is all the preparation that's being done, Chantal, but I think it's the what you've all demonstrated here. It's the complete unpredictability and chaos of a government, whether it be this government or a future government, having to be constantly on pins and needles to respond to or figure out the president. And in this case, I take what Andrew's saying, but it could also be an economic disaster, you know, if the economy can't adapt to this.
Okay, but at some point, we need to go back to basics. The United States negotiated the FTA, then they negotiated NAFTA, then this president renegotiated NAFTA. Do you really think they did that because they love us and they wanted to be nice to us? So, yes, you can probably do the tariff thing the way that the president talks about this, but at the cost of, if not killing, wounding the American auto industry at a crucial time in its history, as part of the industry in other countries is transitioning to electric vehicles. So if you want to do that, because you cannot replace it, I listened to this. We don't need their cars, we don't need their oil, we don't need their aluminum. Oh, possibly if you get down to it, in 5 or 10 years you don't.
Yeah.
But at this point you do.
Yeah.
That's just reality. And I'm afraid sometimes that we are falling into what I call the beaten wife syndrome. I must have said the wrong thing. That's why this is happening to me. We do have cards to play. And yes, times can get hard economically, but that doesn't mean you can't make life hard economically for others who are south of the border.
Andrew?
We have to be careful how we react. No, we don't overreact in a couple of directions. We should absolutely be as open to trade with other countries as we possibly can, but there's a certain amount of gravity that's going to exert itself no matter what in terms of our two-way trade. What we should absolutely be doing is making ourselves more resilient in terms of having other reasons and much more competitive economy where there'll be other reasons why somebody would want to invest here, even with the tariff, even if the tariff remains. So there's certainly longer-term lessons, longer-term adjustments we can be making. But the final point I'll just say is, it's always a good rule in politics not to underestimate your adversary. It's also a good rule not to overestimate and not to attribute to Trump some kind of grand strategic design.
Right.
When what is more likely the explanation is pique and petulance and ego and stupidity.
Last 30, 40 seconds to you, Althea.
So I think I see it in a little less personal, but I do think that Chantal raises a really good point, and that's short-term versus long-term. What he is threatening to do will could significantly impact our long-term economic fortunes as well as the Americans. It's a rejigging. In the short term, there will be more investment flowing to the United States, for sure. But this is a guy who has 4 years to get stuff done. So clearly, he can start things, he can make big announcements, but there won't be an enormous follow through. So what can we give him as a short-term win? And I think we need to start thinking in those terms if we're not already thinking in those terms.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Smart conversation. We will talk more about it, I'm sure. And with that, I'll send things back to Adrian in Washington.
Thank you, Rosie. Coming up, another look at the disaster and its shockwaves.
I think it's a shock. We're just trying to comprehend. It's terrible.
How those affected are holding it together, or at least trying to, after the break. As the world anxiously waits for answers as to what actually happened in the air last night, all anybody can do is try to process past 24 hours. So to close tonight, we take a look back at the horror and the heartbreak.
So somewhere around 8:50 p.m., I hear 2 bombs. It's not like any bombs I've heard before.
Did you see that?
Yep, we saw it.
Both the helicopter and the plane crashed in the river. I just saw a fireball and then it was just gone.
Yeah, we witnessed the whole thing.
Horrendous. Unbelievable. Shocking.
We were in the middle of the air. We were scared, we were shocked.
Literally the most horrifically tragic night that I can remember.
Could that have been us? I mean, it's a scary thought.
67 innocent lives were lost.
To the best of our knowledge, 14 skaters were lost in the plane crash at Washington, D.C.
I think it's a shock.
We're just trying to comprehend. It's terrible.
They were so close to home, you know.
We ask you to help them recover all of the bodies of these lost souls.
Please join us now in a moment of silence.
It's devastating for everyone.
It's jarring to look and listen to all that. It's jarring to realize that as the recovery effort continues in the waters behind us, this airport is active again with planes coming and going right now. From all of us at the National, thank you for being with us. I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Take care.